Purpose Highway is a space for discussions that drive connections toward people's highest purpose to build a better self and a better world. Join me for season 1, where I start to uncover stories of entrepreneurs and thinkers that are making an impact. I'm your host, Scott Mason, and enjoy today's episode. Hello, everybody. It's Scott Mason, revving up for another ride down the Purpose Highway. And sitting with me on the front seat today is John Bartlett. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you. And I've got my seatbelt on. I'm ready to go.
And we're going to ride. So, John, you are a world famous fashion designer. And, you know, your resume is, to understate things, impressive. You know, there have been profiles about you, multiple profiles, by the way, in the New York Times. International magazines like Time Magazine have done profiles of you. Your work has been praised by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You have had your work in several men's fashion weeks. You've received awards from the Council of Fashion Designers of America. I think Designer of the Year maybe twice. You've received awards from the American Apparel and Footwear Association. You received a Lexus Eco Fashion Award. You've partnered with Nick Worcester. And you're a professor. And this is kind of the coolest of all. You started a 90s revival of Hush Puppies shoes. So anyone that would do that, we have to just start there. Tell us what?
Well, you know what? I'm so glad that you brought that up because I don't think about that so much. So it really all started because as a fashion designer, anytime I was doing a fashion show, one of the biggest problems was finding shoes for 20 models. And so we'd have to find, one shoe per outfit or whatever. And so it started off very innocently. I had always loved Hush Puppies because Hush Puppies to me reminded me of my 3 sons. It reminded me of kind of 60s, late 50s, early 60s, classic preppy guys. And that was the vibe I was going for. So we reached out to them and they partnered with us very willingly. And we ended up, they had some classic shoes that they had basically stopped using, and they had kind of gone into the trends of the 90s. And so we brought back those original styles but did them in bright colors. And those shoes, I think, resonated with so many people. And so it was a really, really amazing experience wherein we showed these shoes on the runway and then they took off, and every buyer from Barney's to Saks Fifth Avenue started buying them, and celebrities started wearing them. And what was really cool, I have to say, Malcolm Gladwell wrote about it in The Tipping Point. He wrote about it in the first chapter of The Tipping Point. This was one of these things that just, for whatever reason, the moment was right. The brand, which is such a great American iconic brand, had such brand awareness for a certain category of customers. And just to update what they already had, we didn't change anything. We just added new colors and put them on the runway at a time when it just seemed to make sense. So it was just one of those, being at the right place and the right time and having an idea. But basically we needed shoes for our models. So it was like a very innocent beginning of a wonderful result.
Amazing. And I've got to say, the idea of walking into Barney's to buy some Hush Puppies is something that when I was a little boy, I probably would never have imagined. So
right.
Thank you for changing my perception of shoe wear permanently, as well as that of a whole company and a whole culture around shoes. I love it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was amazing because American footwear, there's not a lot of American footwear brands. I mean, there are now, but in the day of like classic brands, there's not that many. And most of the shoes that people were buying were Italian, and it was really fun to work with an American iconic brand.
I bet they were so grateful too. John, you started out in Ohio.
Yes.
And ended up living a life in fashion here in New York City and around the world that most of us can only imagine. Now, I'm from Kansas, so I can relate to what that sort of transition is like. But I think a lot of folks would be very curious to know, how on earth did a little boy from Ohio end up living this life? You've got to tell us a little bit about how all that happened.
I will. Thank you. So, I grew up in Cincinnati and went to Harvard for undergrad, which really was a dream come true, something I never would have thought in my wildest dreams. And after Harvard, most of my friends were moving to New York, and I had met a lot of people who were studying fashion at the University of Cincinnati, and so they were all moving to New York as well. And I ended up, after college, I went to London for about 5 months under the auspices of studying economics, but I ended up dropping out of that program after about 2 weeks because I'm like, this is not for me. I never told my parents, so I ended up cashing in my tuition and just experiencing London. And London in the mid-'80s was a very, very exciting, very diverse and inspiring city.
I can only imagine.
Oh my gosh, it was incredible. And so I really found, I was so inspired by the world of fashion that I thought, this is what I want to do. I told my parents, who were not thrilled, but my dad gave me some great advice, which I still repeat anytime I get the chance. So both my parents came from very humble, small towns in Ohio. And my dad said, okay, well, if you want to work in fashion, then do whatever you have to do. If you have to wheel racks down 7th Avenue, do that. If you have to pick up pins, do that. Do whatever it takes. Say yes to everything. And I feel that was such great advice because that's what I did. And it was a wonderful trajectory that was not a straight line. And it was an experience where one person introduced me to the next.
Wow.
And it just kept happening. And so I feel very grateful for that. Yeah. But yes, so coming from Cincinnati, I think I'm thrilled. I think maybe you are too. I loved having that sort of Midwestern foundation. Yeah. And then being able to, in some ways, apply it to the rigors of New York City. But so I ended up going to Fashion Institute of Technology, studying menswear. I loved it. And I worked for a couple of amazing designers, had some amazing mentors. And then in 1992, 93, this is interesting and important. So, of course, moving to New York City I moved in '86, and it was the early beginning of the AIDS crisis. And so one of my best friends from Cincinnati, who I had always talked about starting a fashion business with, ended up being one of the people dying of AIDS, and he died in '92. And he and I were very, very close. And it was really a result of his death in many ways that I was inspired and empowered to just be like, screw it. I'm going to start my own company. What do I have to lose? It was very life affirming in many ways. I think that when we lose people, it wakes us up. And so I think my good friend Rick inspired me to be like, screw it. I'm just going to start this and wing it. I had $5,000 and I started. So it grew and grew. Financially, it was always a challenge. I was always living from $1 to the next, literally, because fashion is and I don't think people understand this. It is such a cash drain. It's such an investment heavy business that because you are constantly having to purchase materials, produce things, there's a lot of money that goes into it before you ever see a dime back. So it's always a game to try to create something, get it out onto the market, show it in such a way. So, but it was a very exciting time. And the business grew. I moved all of my production to Italy. I started showing both men's and women's wear in Milan, Tokyo. I had stores around the world. And then the company that was backing me ended up getting sold. And so right around 9/11, everything changed. And I basically started over again. And I started over 3 or 4 times, all with different incarnations, different inspirations. But one of the greatest takeaways from my experience as a designer, so as a student at Harvard, I studied sociology, and I feel that fashion is a form of sociology. When we see people on the street, I think that we respond, we react, we learn a lot about our culture through what people are wearing, and through what certain countercultures or subcultures are wearing. So for me, fashion was a really wonderful exploration of gender, diversity, race, sexuality, all those things that I was interested in as an undergrad. I was able to really explore in my work through fashion. And so I feel like through the years, I've gotten to really work through all of these very interesting things that to me, I think are relevant. Again, things that are about different subcultures, and have really had the opportunity to explore a lot of things and present ideas about them and have other people ideally have a response or just think about it. Again, thinking about gender roles or what is gender or sexuality and what is masculinity, what is femininity, race, all of these things that I think come up over and over again in both our community and in the fashion world. So it's been a wonderful ride.
There's so much embedded in what you said. We could talk for hours. Just with follow-up questions that I have, I'm actually going to start with going back to the story about what your dad told you. And I'm actually going to just briefly share a story about you. You and I met because I used to co-own a silkscreen printing company, and you came to the shop in God knows where, Brooklyn, to meet us and to get a sense as to whether we were capable of doing the work for you. I remember so vividly, it was a summer day. It was hot. We did not have an air conditioning unit in the shop. I had a little office under stairs. You came and sat in there and we talked. And I remember, I know I was sweating. You were sweating. It was unglamorous. It was unfashionable. You brought your full self. You were warm. You were interested. You were engaged. And then, I had done some research on you before you came, and then I did some afterwards. And it really, I remember telling people about this later. This man came in here that has been around the world on on fashion runways. And here he was under the stairs without air conditioning, sweating away in front of another person that he had just met as if we'd been best friends our whole lives. And so one of the questions that raises for me is that value that you were demonstrating that day carried, I assume, from your father or maybe from somewhere else, around humility, around treating everyone with respect. Was that something that was ever hard for you to continue to live as you were in a world that most of the people watching or listening to this may view as very high flight and snooty?
Snooty. I love that
word. Word of the day.
Thank you for that. So, yes, I think that both my parents, I think they really instilled in us, meaning myself and my siblings, just the sense that we're all meant to be treated well when we can. And again, nobody's perfect. Having gone through the experience where I was flying business class around the world and being catered to, I definitely got bratty. I got entitled. I had a sense of entitlement. I changed, and I know that. And while I did try to maintain a sense of humility, and sometimes humility can be combined with insecurity because, I don't know. Anyway, that's a whole other conversation. But I definitely became on many levels, entitled because things were being handed to me. I was being told certain things. I was believing my own press, etc. And so I definitely went through a lot of different stages in my life where I had to really look deeply at that. So the bottom line, though, is that the industry is filled with incredible people, incredibly nice, humble people. But because of the, I think from the outside looking in, I think, again, the fashion industry does look like a place where we're flying around the world. And again, now with the concepts of sustainability, all of these things are changing. The industry is changing very, very quickly. But I think in the 90s and the early 2000s, it was all about luxury. It was all about how much money can you spend, how much money can you make, and how much press can you get, and who's on your runway, and who's in your front row, and which celebrities are you dressing, and all of these things, some of them that I didn't really feel comfortable with, but I would participate in. But at the bottom line, and we can talk about this, I think that humans, we experience loss, we experience a lot of things that bring us back to what's valuable and what's real.
Yeah. And we're definitely going to talk about some of the last things that you said. But before that, I did have a question for you when you talked the last few sentences before we went into this digression around exploring the sociological implications of fashion and thinking about it more deeply than just something that people might be wearing.
Right.
And, people can trivialize fashion. And I actually agree with you. The fashion choices that we make, both as a culture and as individuals, are making statements, whether we realize or are willing to accept it or not. And so one of the questions that I had for you, particularly because as I did research into your own history, one of the things that people more or less said about your work over and over, and that you hinted at a minute ago, your sensibility pushed boundaries. It was visionary. It caused people to think about some of these roles. And you've touched on it a little bit, but I'd love for you to dive in a little more deeply. Because, some might say, oh, was that just a matter of personal expression? Some of that might have been a desire to provoke. Some of it might have been, as you said, an exploration of sociology. The other thing that I want to ask you is whether the AIDS crisis that was still challenging at the time had anything to do with that, or is that just Scott Mason talking again?
I think that the AIDS crisis, especially, that's a great place to start because, so I started off in menswear and then I did women's wear as well, but I feel like I made a lot more inroads and statements about menswear because menswear is a much quieter and in those days a much smaller industry, not as many players. And I think one of the effects or the side effects of the AIDS crisis is that the idea of masculinity and the idea of what is sexy as a man changed. So as the AIDS crisis was hitting, the gay culture had an iconic sort of very hyper masculine look.
Yeah.
Beards and mustaches and body hair and lumberjacks and all this stuff, and which was kind of embodied by the village people. But really there was a real hyper masculinity that was going on when the AIDS crisis hit. It was very interesting because you could see a 360 start. The runways were then filled with very young, almost boyish guys. Cleanly shaven, very groomed, almost asexual. There was no sexuality, very little sexuality that was being presented on the runway, whereas in women's wear, there was a lot of sexuality happening. And so in many ways, designers went back into the closets. Menswear, the sexuality men's sexuality in many ways went back into the closet. So one of the things that was interesting to me was to really look back on the fashion and the men of the time before AIDS, and to celebrate what those men look like. So to me, I was very interested in showing guys that had big hair, big sideburns and mustaches and muscles, and really sexualize these guys. It was a really wonderful journey for me. And I got a lot of flack for it because it was almost like I got a lot of criticism that my clothes were too gay. And in those days, that was not a good thing. Now, like, nobody cares. The generation of today, they don't have those same hang-ups about sexuality and gender. We're still work in progress. But in those days, a lot of retailers would shy away from the product because they were worried that they might be associated. So it was very interesting. But I think that, AIDS and that those times really played into so much of my work. And again, it certainly played into my whole personal journey. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that one of the things, again, that you mentioned earlier that is something that can be easy for people to forget, and that is the power of loss to motivate positive change.
Absolutely.
And so, for instance, to hear that the death of someone close to you actually was the inspiration for you to take that plunge and to, move ahead in a direction that utterly changed your life is, in terms of connection with purpose, something that folks might find utterly out of the blue.
I think that when I speak to people from those days and now, and of course, loss affects everybody differently. And again, we'll speak about that. But I do think that it generally inspires people at some level because there's a legacy involved. And but again, for me, I just realized, like, life is so short. And I think about this pretty much every day. We have an expiration date and we don't know when that is.
Yes.
And what can we do with our time?
Yes.
And so that was I was in my 20s. My friend was very young. He was maybe 30 years old when he died. So it was definitely, we were a generation that lost friends in our 20s. And that was unheard of except, during the wars. And so I think that we grew up as a generation pretty fast.
Yeah.
And, but yeah, so for me, it inspired me to just dive off the deep end. And I think also I'm an Aries, so I love throwing myself into uncomfortable situations because for me, it's the only way to know and it's the only way to learn.
John, I'm an Aries too.
See? You can relate. You understand.
I totally can relate. I never knew that. Okay, so that's one for the books. We'll talk about that off the record. John, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, but please fill in the gaps as you see fit. Who was Tiny Tim?
Tiny Tim. Hold on one second. Okay, thank you. All right. By the way, that's Hug. Hug is one of my 3 dogs. He just came back with the dog walker. Tiny Tim, when I turned 40 years old, I wanted to adopt a dog. I had been in a relationship and we had, my ex and I had a dog and I loved her dearly, but as a single man, because at this point I was single again, I wanted to adopt a dog. And I went to the North Shore Animal League looking for a small dog that I could travel with. And here was this beautiful 3-legged pit bull mix. The first dog I saw when I walked into the kennel. And our eye, it was love at first sight. It was love at first hairy sight. Our eyes locked, and that was it. And so I adopted him, and his name was Tiny Tim. And Tiny Tim got his name because he was brought into the shelter. He had been hit by a car and had no home, apparently, was a stray, and had a mangled leg. So they operated and removed his leg on Christmas Eve, and so they called him Tiny Tim. And I could never think of a better name. And Tiny Tim and I were together. I think we had a good 10 years together, 9 years. Then he died of lymphoma, but he changed my life. He changed my life in so many ways. And when he passed, I speaking again of loss, when he passed, the only thing I could do after crying for a couple of weeks was to start volunteering at the city shelter up in East Harlem.
Mm-hmm.
And on my way to the shelter, I was so nervous because I knew that it was it was a kill shelter.
Mm-hmm.
I imagined Tiny Tim jogging alongside of me. He had to jog because he only had one front leg.
Mm-hmm.
So he couldn't saunter. He jogged, and he was jogging alongside of me. And right before we got to the shelter, a couple months after he had passed, I imagined him just jumping into my heart and curling up like he would in his dog bed. And there and that's where he lives. So Tiny Tim inspired me to start working in rescue. I started a foundation called the Tiny Tim Rescue Fund, wherein I would raise money, and still do, for independent rescue groups that are on the front lines and need money for veterinary bills, transportation, training, whatever they need. And it's been a really wonderful sort of side hustle for me that has really informed a lot of my life over the last 10 years.
Tell us a story or two about Tiny Tim.
Oh, boy. Well, Tiny Tim, he was, again, a pit bull mix. When we would, again, run down the street because he couldn't really walk in the same way that most dogs with four legs walk, where they saunter. I mean, he literally had to gallop to keep moving, to keep the gravitational force moving forward. And so we would always, people would basically either jump out of the way. Like, I had these images of people diving into bushes. They were afraid of him. And I think seeing a three-legged dog coming at you can sometimes, I would see people's eyes light up. It would bring them into the moment of, oh my God, here's this dog who's just getting on with things. And he's obviously handicapped. And I think that he, again, inspired a lot of people that he would meet on the street because he was just getting on with things. And I think animals teach us that. They just keep moving. They're not self-conscious.
Yeah.
So people would either jump into a bush to get out of his way, or they would get on their knees and come and want to meet him. And so he really touched a lot of hearts. And we had, with a friend, Tiny Tim married his best friend, Mojo, who was a male bulldog. So we had a gay dog marriage as a big fundraiser. And my friend who helped me with this, she ended up, she was Mojo's dad. Mojo's mom. She ended up hiring a car. So Tiny Tim and Mojo got in the back seat and they drove away with the cans, in the back, just married. But we raised a lot of money for rescue in doing this. It was really fun. But Tiny Tim was a fabulous guy, and he eventually developed lymphoma, and I could tell the day that he was ready to go. And it's never, ever, ever easy. But his loss was profound. Yeah. And again, he still lives in my heart. He's right there with me.
John, during the preparation for this interview, I asked you questions about some of the themes that we talk about on the show regularly, and you said that this one in particular spoke to you. Life is cyclical. When every journey ends, a new one begins. And we've sort of hinted at some of this earlier in the interview.
Yeah. Let's
talk about a little bit more what that means for you and why that speaks to you.
Good question. I mean, I loved everything that you put forward, and I was really hard. I wanted to talk about every subject, every tenet.
And we could.
But I thought that, life is cyclical, and I think that all of us have so many lifetimes in one life. And I know that, and I think that for some reason, living in New York City, we are constantly being encouraged and forced to change. We're constantly being forced to confront what's in front of us. And I think I learned early on when I moved to New York that either I had to deal with my emotions and deal with my fears, or I just or couldn't live here. So in a way, New York is a really wonderful place for personal growth. And so a couple of different things on that topic about cyclical and change. Well, one of the most interesting things is I think when we talk about career. So I had this wonderful fashion career. There was definitely a peak on one level wherein I was traveling around the world, showing collections, being featured in magazines, and like I think most things, there is an expiration date, um, and so that kind of I moved through that time, and it was really hard because at one point I wasn't the flavor of the month anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I had to do a lot of. It was a very uncomfortable time,
Mm-hmm.
and so with that, then I set on a different path of just okay. So I've made this name for myself. Now I need to make some money because I hadn't actually made any money
Mm-hmm.
during those years of these enormous fashion shows and big press junkets.
It's like unbelievable, isn't it?
It's
It's
the
surreal.
way it is. So I'm like, okay, let me try to figure out how can I monetize this. So I started to license my name. I started to work with other companies. I worked with Liz Claiborne, which was great. I worked with Tim Gunn. For those of you who watch Project Runway, I worked with him. He was at Claiborne at the time. So I worked with a bunch of brands, and I ended up, my last big fashion gig lasted about 8 years. I was working with a big group of department stores out of the Midwest in Milwaukee called the Bon-Ton Stores. They had 260 stores, and I was their private label brand, but it was an opening price point, very basic, very straightforward product that was very, very different from what I had been designing earlier. And but I was very happy because I was finally making a living,
Yeah.
and it was a wake up aha moment for me because I realized that my own career has been very cyclical in the sense that it's had a lot of different stages. And in the early part, it was absolutely naive and in many ways bold. And I was really able to explore all those things that really to me were very, very important. Again, sexuality and gender and race and religion and identity, body positivity, all these things that I think that are so interesting. And then, but it culminated in a really wonderful real world experience wherein I was designing for the basic average American
Right.
customer.
Right.
And but I was able to really find creativity in that and inspiration, but it was different. And so, but during that time, that's when I started to get more interested in animal, what's the word I'm looking for? Animal rights.
Mm-hmm.
And so as Tiny Tim, right before Tiny Tim died, which was now 10 years ago, I read a book by Alicia Silverstone, who is an actress and an animal activist.
Mm-hmm.
And it was called The Kind Diet. And a friend of mine gave it to me. And so pretty much overnight, I decided I'm going vegan. I'm no longer going to eat animals, digest animal byproducts, no longer wear anything that's associated with animal agriculture. And it was, again, a huge wake-up call for me. It was a real personal journey. And so, I was able to kind of, while I was making money working in fashion, I was able to really do this interesting sideline work about animal activism, raising awareness about what's going on behind the scenes and why we can live without harming animals and still have a very full life and have wonderful products and wonderful food and all of these things. So it was a really amazing and continues to be an amazing journey. I met some really true warriors who were, again, were on the front lines, whether they were in animal rescue, were working to raise awareness about plant life living, raising awareness about what's happening at the fur farms or what's happening at dairy farms, et cetera. So it was a very exciting time for me because it started to inform my own fashion sensibility, my own design sense. From there, I was able to, I started to design in a very different way. And that's when I won the Lexus Eco Challenge Award. It was a grant that was a competition, and I was able to create a collection that was completely plant-based, recycled,
Amazing.
etc. And it was a really wonderful experience because I had lived in a fashion world where all the buzzword was luxury and give me cashmere, give me the best silk, give me the best, everything, leather, fur, etc. That was what was considered luxury. Today, luxury is a very different concept, and now I think the new customer really is looking at recycled fabrics, sustainable fabrics, full transparency. So it's been really a wonderful, interesting journey for me, and so that's one thing. And I think that as far as like cyclical, it's been interesting. But the final thing I want to say about that, career-wise, cyclically, is that. So when my Bon-Ton gig ended, they went out of business a couple of years ago, like many department stores.
Yeah.
I said, okay, I don't know what I'm going to do next, so let me dive into the world of working in animal advocacy nonprofits. So I worked for two different big rescues, one in the city and one in Virginia, that was advocating for dogs living their lives chained. And it was really powerful, very profound, and I learned a lot. But I also realized that while I have a passion for this, I wasn't able to really use my own God-given skill set to the fullest degree that I would like to. And while it felt really wonderful to be able to advocate, I realized that there was something missing in my life. And so it's been about a year ago, I guess. I saw a posting for a job for director of fashion at Marist College, which is a wonderful liberal arts college in Poughkeepsie.
Yes.
And I'd heard about them. They have a really great fashion program. And so it was when I saw this job posting, and again, this doesn't happen very often in one's life, I said, oh my God, that's my job. And I applied, and I interviewed, and it was quite a rigorous interviewing process because I know there was a lot of amazing contenders. And so I was given the job, and I began the job. So we're in January. I began the job last April, right as the pandemic was shutting down the world. And but I was so excited about this job, I'm even more excited now that I've been into it for about 9 months. But it's a job wherein I'm the director of this fashion program. We have about 520 students studying fashion design, fashion merchandising, marketing, promotion, buying, and what is so wonderful, and getting back to this idea of cyclical and getting back to this idea of change and evolution. So I finally feel that I'm able to really apply all those things that I've learned through my years of fashion, but I'm also able to be of service now. And that to me is paramount, I think, in this time in my life. And to be of service, but also to be able to do something that I love. And I want to, again, go back to something that my dad had told me. My dad passed away about 12 years ago. Great, great guy. When I graduated from Harvard, I had been studying sociology. So I thought, I'm going to be a social worker. And I was doing some social work. And my dad and I always talked about career and work. And he said to me that I would be able to do a lot more for a lot more people if I'm really doing what I love. And that I would be able to be more of service if I'm really in my lane. And so while I think a lot of people think of fashion as a little bit frivolous, superficial, I feel like I found this wonderful way that I can take those things that I love, that I think are really exciting and important, and I love beauty, I love creativity, but now ideally and hopefully I can lead a program that can really elevate the quality of students coming into the industry, and to help to reflect back. The students are very interested in sustainability, diversity, body positivity, gender identity, all these things that I've been so interested in. So I feel like I'm talking to a wonderfully open group of people that in the coming years will be the next generation of creators and merchandisers. So I feel very, very grateful to have this new opportunity where I'm building on what I've learned before. And one thing finally I wanted to say about this. So I think that we all have a very interesting life and career trajectory, and it's never a straight line. And I spent a lot of time over the last couple of years meeting with everybody about everything. Again, something that I did when I first moved to New York. I met with everybody about anything and everything. I said yes to everything. Again, the last 2 years, I've talked to everybody about everything because I wasn't sure where I wanted to go.
Yeah.
But I knew that I wanted to keep things moving. And I know that I love fashion. And I spoke with this one woman who who ended up was doing something very similar to what I'm doing now. And she told me to call her in a couple of years because she'd be interested to see how one's trajectory has gone, because it's never a straight line. And yet it all makes sense when you look back. And that's what I love. Like things I had, all of these things I tried, they all make sense now that I'm, where I'm at today.
Sometimes I feel like, and by the way, I can, even though I'm only 23, I can totally, when I look back on the 4 careers that I've had in my 23 years of life, I can relate. It's sort of surprising the way these things end up coming together like a tapestry. Yes. And in a way, that tapestry analogy, kind of ties into the idea of apparel and of textile as a metaphor for how these large patterns can emerge into something beautiful, amazing, and powerful in our lives.
Absolutely.
John, this has been phenomenal. We could, again, as we know, we could talk for hours and hours and hours and only begin to scratch the surface. I want to make sure that folks know a couple of things in particular about you. First of all, you have a podcast. Can you talk to us briefly about that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I have a podcast called Dog Save the People, and we have a website. And it's been really, an amazing learning curve for me. So I speak to different people whose lives have been changed by their by having a dog in their life. And it's been a very diverse group of guests, and it's been something that I've so enjoyed. We're in our we've been doing it for almost 2 years.
Yeah.
So I have probably a good 100 episodes up now.
Yeah.
And that's been a wonderful experience for me.
And how can people find out more about Tiny Tim and some of the other work that you have out there, particularly the animal rescue work? Any particular shout outs that you want to give or information that you want to share?
Well, I guess on Instagram. So my website, John Bartlett NY, is under construction because I'm trying to revamp what I'm about and what I'm representing. So I would guess on Instagram, I have 2 different handles. John Bartlett NY, and then John Bartlett Vegan, I think is what it is. Because I do like to talk about vegan issues. I think that it's really important, but I also don't like to shove it down people's throats, which I did when I was a newbie, because I would chase people down the street if they had a fur coat on, those poor people. And but now, again, part of my journey has been to understand that we all have our own. We all have our own timelines, and for me, if somebody wants to go vegan, or if somebody wants to, whatever it is, it's up to us. It's our own journey, and so it's none of my business anymore. And that's what I've learned. I'm trying to learn that every day. I'm still, it's a hard lesson to learn. So that's really it. I mean, I guess Instagram, and people can message me. I love to meet new people. I'm single. And can we talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely.
Okay. And I don't know how much time we have, but I think it's an important aspect of the journey that I wanted to share.
Yes.
So 4 years ago, my husband died of prostate cancer. His name was John. And John and I, this was the love of my life. And I thought we were going to live the rest of our lives together and grow old together and have dogs together. And this was a very healthy, active man who suddenly was hit with a very, very prostate cancer, and he died at age 56. And boy, that changed everything for me. Again, talking about loss, it changed. I basically, my life ended, and I had to kind of find a new way to live and a new way to learn to live. And so I did a lot of bereavement work. I joined a lot of different groups, men's groups. I met some other men who'd also lost their husbands to cancer. Did a lot of soul searching. And, now 4 years later, I'm in a much, much better place. I celebrate his life. I feel like while I have lost this man, there are so many gifts that I've been given and that I've received through going through this loss. And I'm looking forward to my next chapter and dating here and there, and understanding that person, if it's meant to be, will come along. But one of the things I did want to share that I think is important to talk about, that you don't know about, is that so when John died, I basically shut the door and drank. And alcohol had always been, I remember drinking from the get-go. I couldn't wait to drink beer and smoke cigarettes, et cetera, as a kid, because I wanted to be an adult so fast. But I had noticed that during my 40s, late 40s, early 50s, that alcohol was definitely becoming more of an issue for me. And then after John died, I literally shut the door and just allowed myself to drink to my heart's content.
Wow.
Until I had started this whole rhythm where I would wake up in the morning, I would take a couple ibuprofen, maybe take a half a Xanax because I was having anxiety, and I would stop drinking for a couple of weeks, a few months at a time, but it always came back to having a glass of wine, and then it was, as they say, I was off to the races again. And so a little bit over 2 years ago, I got sober. And talk about a life change. And I don't speak about this a lot, but I think this is really important I wanted to share this with you because it has changed my life. And I'm so grateful to have this time now. And because I think that I was in a place where I thought, okay, this is just the way my life is going to be. I was kind of resigned to the fact that, alcohol was going to play a big part of my life, and that I was going to be navigating my life, hangovers and drinking. And now having this time in sobriety, again, there have been so many beautiful gifts that have come my way. And I feel like it's really important to be open about it. And I'm very, I've met so many incredible people who also are living in sobriety. And I never thought this would be me. I never did. And yet here I am, So that's something I wanted to share.
And I actually did want to delve into that for a few minutes because, again, as usual, what you say has multiple layers to it that I think is important to address. First of all, the idea of loss, I'll just personally speak to that. As you know, I've been, with my husband for 22 years. He is the love of my life. And I think a lot of people who have the love of their lives can relate to the fact if I woke up tomorrow and something happened to him. It's funny, I was at a convention by myself in 2019, the last vacation that I took before, one of the last vacations I took before the world changed.
Yeah.
And he was not with me at that convention. I went by myself. And I remember checking into that hotel room and thinking, actually, if I had to, I was alone. I didn't know anyone at the convention. I remember thinking, if I had to live like this day after day, I would die of loneliness. I remember thinking that so vividly. And the part of why I share that story with you is not just to empathize, although I do, but to state that for men, it can be difficult to acknowledge that, first of all. And then number two, even with all of the progress that our community, and by that I mean the LGBTQ plus community, has made, I have found that people don't take our relationships or the love that we feel for each other as seriously. I get asked all the time, are you and David still together? He and I are married. We've been together 22 years. He ain't going anywhere. And so that there also is this, to me, this invisibility aspect, or this lack of ability to talk about the profundity of that loss with people a lot of times. Number one. Number two, I can easily imagine that a loss of that magnitude, particularly if there were any issues around the availability of resources to deal with it, sending me my particular spiral might not be the same as yours. But there could be all sorts of spirals that I could go into that would be unpleasant for me and for everyone around me. And so he's sort of hearing those two thought trains after what you said. What is your thinking and what's your intellectual ping pong or your emotional ping pong in response to that?
How do you mean? I'm sorry.
Well, do those remarks trigger anything in you, or what sort of thinking do they lead to you, if anything?
Yeah, no, I do agree. I mean, I think that, again, I feel very blessed because I have a family and friends, and I live in a community where I do feel like my relationship, my marriage was taken seriously for the most part. And yet, certainly we live in a world that does not still fully acknowledge, I think, or understand different types of relationships, different types of sexuality. I just think, but we've come so far. But I do think that, yes, it's interesting. It's funny when as a single man, I will have people be like, oh, I know somebody who's gay. I'm going to fix them up with you. I'm like, great, and yet it's a one in a million. It's a needle in a haystack, I think, for all of us. And I think that people will possibly generalize. Oh, he's gay, you're gay, you'll be great together, And so I do. I agree with you to an extent. And that is, I'm sorry that people still are asking you if you're still together. Oh, boy. But that's funny and sad.
Can I ask, how exactly did you find your way to sobriety? Tell us a story there.
Well, I had, so I have a I have a wonderful therapist now who has helped me tremendously, but I had a wonderful therapist for many, many, many years, and she and I talked ad nauseum about alcohol, and we talked about the idea of controlled drinking, and I just felt like that it had become a problem, and that I had a number of experiences where I had found myself, without meaning to be, out of control, and not out of control in the sense that I was dangerous or harming myself, but just out of control because I had drank too much. Yeah. And these were always mostly times when it was a time of celebration, whether it was a birthday or a holiday or a big black tie gala. I found that I had no off button. Yeah. And that was a really hard thing to come to terms with, because I tried to stop a few times, and I didn't really have the support system, the community, or the tools to do that. I was just kind of like, I was as they say, what's the word I'm looking for? It'll come to me. But I was basically just like hanging on for dear life. But it was a very tense experience. Now I feel like with a community around me of other sober people, we're able to like kind of help each other. And so, but yeah, I went through a period where I would, I would have a couple glasses of wine every night, sometimes more, sometimes less. But the last night that I drank, I went to a benefit, and I had no intention of, having more than a glass or two of wine. And I ended up having many more, to the point where I remember just stumbling home. And I was staying with a then boyfriend at the time, because I was just moving into a new place. And I remember getting to his place, and I couldn't speak. I couldn't form a sentence. And I went to bed. I woke up the next morning, and I'm like, I'm done. And that was it, and so again, I started going to some 12-step meetings, and that helped me tremendously. And I've gotten very involved in that world. And again, I've met some amazing people, and have developed through my time some wonderful tools for living. But yes, so I just kept having these experiences where I did not have a turn-off switch, and I didn't, and I had no, I had no intention of drinking as much as I would, but it was like it just kept coming. I couldn't get enough. And that is something that was very hard for me to accept about myself.
I think for successful people, it can be all the harder to accept. And I think it's really important that you share that with our audience, because the other thing too is a lot of times people just see the qualities in a human being that make them successful. They don't necessarily see some of the internal challenges that people have. And so they might not be able to fully connect with the lessons that those folks have to share with all of us. That is, as is the case with this, something that folks need to hear, and is profoundly relatable. And so I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. It's important.
John, this has been an amazing trip down the Purpose Highway. Thank you so much for coming on here. Thank you for being so raw. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
And for everybody listening, yes. And then do you have anything last you want to say before we close out?
I think I'm going to tell you, I think you're a wonderful interviewer, and I love that you're so passionate about this. And I'm glad to be part of the journey for you.
Thank you. I'm proud to have you. Mm-hmm. For everyone watching or listening, check in next time for another trip down the Purpose Highway. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Join our community today at purposehighway.com and subscribe to get notified when new episodes go live. Scott Mason, checking out.